Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content explores the historical, legal, and social landscape of divorce in 1980s America. This video is intended strictly for educational and entertainment purposes. It does not constitute legal, financial, or professional advice. Laws regarding domestic relations have changed significantly over the decades and vary by jurisdiction. Therefore, viewers should conduct their own due diligence and consult with a qualified professional regarding any modern legal matters. Imagine it is 1982. You have worked 15 years at a mid-level corporate firm, you have a 3-bedroom ranch in the suburbs, 2 kids in Little League, and a station wagon in the driveway. Then one Tuesday evening, the no-fault revolution knocks on your door. In a matter of months, the life you spent nearly 2 decades building is dismantled by a legal system that, for the first time in history, is improvising the rules of the game in real time. For men in the 1980s, divorce wasn't just a personal failure. It was a high-stakes collision with a legislative experiment that often left them emotionally bankrupt and financially gutted. In this opening chapter of our deep dive, we are uncovering why the 1980s was the most volatile decade to be a man in a courtroom, and how the clean break philosophy of the era created a blueprint for the modern family court system we see today. If you want to understand why your father or grandfather talks about his ex-wife's lawyer with a certain kind of thousand-yard stare, you need to see the data and the shift in policy that defined this era. The 1980s represented a massive tectonic shift in the American household. To understand the plight of the 1980s husband, we first have to look at the no-fault explosion. By the time 1980 rolled around, the no-fault divorce movement, which began in California in 1970, had swept across almost every state in the Union. Before this, you needed a reason: adultery, cruelty, or abandonment. You needed a villain. But by the 80s, irreconcilable differences became the phrase of the decade. While this was touted as a way to reduce conflict, the reality for many men was a sudden loss of leverage. You could be a perfect husband by 1950 standards, providing a paycheck and never missing a mortgage payment, and still find yourself served with papers for no specific legal fault of your own. This era introduced the concept of the standard of living trap. In the 1980s, courts began focusing heavily on ensuring that the displaced spouse, usually the wife, who in the early 80s was often still a homemaker or secondary earner, could maintain the lifestyle she enjoyed during the marriage. For the 1980s man, this often meant the two-household problem. Data from the era suggests that after a divorce, a man's standard of living technically rose in some metrics because he was supporting fewer people in his immediate vicinity, but his liquid assets were often decimated by the equal distribution laws that were being codified state by state. Let's look at a case study of a typical 1980s professional. If a couple owned a home worth $80,000 in 1984, the court didn't just look at who paid the mortgage. They looked at marital property. This was a relatively new and aggressive concept. It meant that even if the house was in the husband's name, the wife's contribution as a homemaker was suddenly given a high market valuation. In many 1980s courtrooms, men were forced to buy out their wives' half of the home equity at a time when interest rates were hovering around 12 to 14%. This forced many men to sell the family home or take on massive high-interest debt just to settle the property division. Then there was the tender years doctrine and its lingering shadow. Although the 1970s had started to move toward the best interests of the child, the 1980s were still firmly entrenched in the belief that mothers were the primary caregivers. For a father in 1985, seeking primary or even joint custody was an uphill battle that was statistically unlikely to succeed. Joint custody was a radical new concept that was only just beginning to gain legislative traction. Most men were relegated to weekend father status, the classic every other weekend and Wednesday nights schedule. This wasn't just an emotional blow, it was a financial one. Because the mother almost always received primary physical custody, the father was almost always the one paying child support. The 1980s also saw the federalization of child support enforcement. In 1984, the Child Support Enforcement Amendments were passed. This allowed for the mandatory withholding of child support from wages and the interception of federal tax refunds. For the first time, the federal government was getting involved in the deadbeat dad narrative that dominated 1980s media. While these laws were designed to catch those who truly abandoned their responsibilities, they often caught men who were struggling with the aforementioned 14% interest rates and the sudden loss of their primary assets. We must also discuss the psychological profile of the 1980s man going through this process. This was a generation raised by men who fought in World War II or Korea, men who didn't talk about their feelings. There were very few support groups for divorced men in 1982. The social stigma remained high, but the legal protection had vanished. This created a perfect storm of isolation. A man would lose his home, lose daily contact with his children, and see 30 to 50% of his gross income diverted to his ex-spouse and the state. Consider the alimony shift of the mid-80s. We transitioned from permanent alimony to rehabilitative alimony. The idea was that the ex-wife would receive support only long enough to get back on her feet. However, in practice, the courts often set these payments based on the husband's potential income, not his actual current earnings. If a man was an engineer making $45,000 a year, the court expected him to keep making $45,000, even if the stress of the divorce caused his performance to slip or if the mid-80s manufacturing recession hit his industry. The 1980s also birthed the divorce industry. This was the decade of the high-powered celebrity divorce lawyer. Legal fees skyrocketed. A contested divorce in a major U.S. city could easily cost upwards of $20,000 in 1980s dollars, which is over $60,000 today. Men were often advised by their own counsel to settle quick, because the court systems were so backlogged and the judges were so unpredictable in their application of the new no-fault laws. This unpredictability is a historical trend we see throughout the decade. Without clear precedents for how to split 401ks, which were brand new, having only been created in 1978, or professional degrees, many men found their future retirement funds on the chopping block before they even understood what they were. By diving into these specific legal and social hurdles, we aren't just looking at history. We are looking at the foundation of the modern American family. The 1980s was the laboratory where the rules of child support, property division, and best interests were tested on a generation of men who were largely unprepared for the results. Understanding this decade is the key to understanding why the divorce rate peaked during this time, and why the crisis of the American father became a national conversation that still hasn't ended. This masterclass will examine the hidden costs, the legislative traps, and the cultural shifts that made 1980s divorce a unique kind of social warfare. To understand the 1980s divorce experience, we have to talk about the literal price of freedom, which in this decade was often calculated using brand new experimental math. Let us look at the case study of a man we will call Michael, a mid-level manager at a manufacturing plant in Ohio in 1983. Michael represents the historical trend of the era. He earns $35,000 a year, which was a solid middle-class salary at the time. He and his wife Sarah have been married for 12 years. When they decide to part ways, Michael assumes that because he worked 60 hours a week to pay for their split-level home and the Ford Taurus in the driveway, the law will recognize his financial stewardship. He is wrong. In the 1980s, the legal system shifted from equitable distribution to a more aggressive interpretation of marital property. This meant that the court began to view the marriage as an economic partnership rather than a contract based on individual earnings. Imagine if you spent a decade building a small business, and suddenly a third party with no business experience was granted 50% of the voting stock and the right to force a liquidation. For Michael, the house was valued at $90,000. Under the new 1980s statutes, the court didn't care that Michael's name was the only one on the deed, or that his overtime pay covered the down payment. The court viewed Sarah's role as a homemaker as a direct contribution to the appreciation of that asset. In many jurisdictions, Michael was faced with a binary choice: sell the house immediately in a depressed housing market or take out a second mortgage at 13% interest to pay Sarah her $45,000 share of the equity. This economic reality created the first major trap for men in the 80s, the equity squeeze. Because interest rates were at historic highs, refinancing to pay out a spouse was a form of financial suicide. Many men ended up in one-bedroom apartments while still paying the mortgage on a house they no longer lived in, simply because the house wouldn't sell, or they couldn't afford to buy out the other party. This wasn't just about the house. It extended to the brand new concept of the Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or QDRO. This was a product of the Retirement Equity Act of 1984. Before this, a man's pension was largely considered his own. After 1984, the federal government cleared the way for state courts to divide private pension plans. For a man like Michael, this meant that his retirement, something he viewed as 20 years away, was suddenly sliced in half today. The legal fees to draft these QDROs added another layer of expense, often costing $500 to $1,000 in 1980s money just for the paperwork. Now, let us look at the secondary financial trap: the professional degree valuation. This was one of the most controversial historical trends of the mid-80s. Suppose Michael had gone to night school to get his MBA while Sarah worked a secretarial job to help cover the books. In several high-profile 1980s cases, courts ruled that a professional degree was a marital asset. They would actually hire an actuary to calculate the potential future earnings that degree would provide over a 30-year career, and then award the wife a percentage of that hypothetical unearned money. Imagine being told in 1986 that you owe your ex-wife a portion of the raises you haven't even received yet. This created a situation where men were essentially mortgaging their future labor to pay for a past relationship. Beyond the assets, we have to address the 1980s child support revolution. In 1988, the Family Support Act changed everything. It mandated that all states establish specific numerical formulas for child support. Before this, it was often at the judge's discretion. While consistency sounds good on paper, the formulas in the late 80s were often draconian. They were calculated based on gross income, not net. For Michael, after federal taxes, state taxes, and his 401k contribution, his take-home pay might be $1,800 a month. But if the state formula dictated $800 in child support based on his gross earnings, he was left with $1,000 to cover his own rent, food, and the debt he took on to pay out the house equity. This led to the rise of the wage garnishment system. In 1984 and 1988, the federal government pushed for immediate income withholding. If you were a man in 1989, your child support was often deducted before you even saw your paycheck. While this ensured children were provided for, it also stripped many men of the ability to manage their own cash flow during financial emergencies. If Michael's car broke down and he couldn't get to work, he couldn't prioritize the car repair over the support payment. The state took its cut first. This created a cycle of debt that many men from that era never truly escaped. We also have to consider the hidden cost of the 1980s legal battle. This was the decade where the adversarial nature of divorce was dialed up to 11. Lawyers began to use a tactic called burning the furniture. This involved filing endless motions, motions for temporary support, motions for psychological evaluations, motions for discovery. Each motion required a retainer. In 1985, a typical retainer for a contested divorce was $2,500 to $5,000. For a man making Michael's salary, that represented his entire savings account. To stay in the fight for his children or his property, he had to go into credit card debt, which in the 80s often carried interest rates upwards of 18%. The psychological impact of this financial depletion cannot be overstated. In 1980s America, a man's worth was heavily tied to his role as a provider. When the court stripped away the house, the pension, and a significant portion of the paycheck, it wasn't just a financial loss. It was a total identity collapse. Men were being told they were still responsible for the financial health of a household. They were no longer allowed to lead or even reside in. This created a phenomenon known as the disappearing father. While the media portrayed these men as deadbeats who chose to leave, historical data suggests a different potential outcome. Many men simply couldn't afford to be fathers. They couldn't afford a home with an extra bedroom for the kids, and they couldn't afford the gas to drive across the state for visitation after the support payments were taken. By 1987, the no-fault dream had turned into a bureaucratic nightmare for the average American male. The legal system was essentially building a plane while flying it, and men like Michael were the crash test dummies. We see the emergence of fathers' rights groups during this period as a direct response to these pressures. They began to realize that the system wasn't just biased in favor of mothers in terms of custody, but it was structurally designed to treat the father as a mobile ATM. But what happened when these men tried to fight back? What happened when they walked into a 1980s courtroom and asked for 50-50 custody to avoid these massive support payments? That is where the story takes an even darker turn. The legal system had a specific psychological weapon waiting for them, one that would redefine the word visitation, and turn the family unit into a battlefield of supervised hours and restricted access. As we move into the next part of this masterclass, we are going to look at the custody ceiling. We will examine the specific psychological theories that judges used in the 80s to keep fathers away from their children, and the rise of the parental alienation era. If you think the financial hit was bad, wait until you see how the 1980s legal system quantified the value of a father's time. How did the tender years doctrine evolve into something even more restrictive? And what was the secret memo that many lawyers used to ensure their male clients never got more than 4 days a month with their kids? The answer lies in a specific set of guidelines that were never supposed to be public. To understand the custody ceiling of the 1980s, we have to look at the psychological landscape that dictated every judicial decision of the era. If you were a father in 1985, you were walking into a courtroom governed by the best interests of the child standard. On the surface, this sounds equitable and compassionate. However, in the 1980s, the interpretation of best interests was almost entirely tethered to a concept known as the psychological parent. This theory, popularized by influential legal and psychological texts of the time, suggested that a child's stability was dependent on having one primary, unchanging caregiver. Because of the historical trends of the 1970s and early 80s, that primary caregiver was almost always assumed to be the mother. Imagine a man named David in 1986. David is a high school teacher in Virginia. He has been deeply involved in his 7-year-old son's life, coaching his soccer team and handling the morning routine for years. When the divorce proceedings begin, David asks for joint physical custody. He wants his son 50% of the time. In 2026, this might seem like a standard starting point, but in 1986, David's request was seen as radical, even selfish. The court's logic followed a rigid step-by-step path. First, they determined who the primary caretaker was during the marriage. Since David worked full-time and his wife worked part-time, the court automatically designated the wife as the primary caregiver. Second, the court applied the stability argument, which claimed that shuffling a child between two homes would cause psychological fragmentation. The potential outcome for David was a standard visitation schedule that became the unofficial law of the land, the first, third, and fifth weekends of every month. This meant that out of 365 days in a year, David was legally permitted to be a father for only about 72 of them. This was the custody ceiling. It was a societal and legal consensus that a father's role was secondary, almost ornamental, once the nuclear family unit was dissolved. This created a generation of Disneyland dads. Because David only had 48 hours with his son every 2 weeks, he felt pressured to make every moment a high-octane celebration. There was no time for discipline, homework, or the mundane rhythms of daily life. The 1980s legal system effectively legislated the parenting out of fatherhood. The secret memo mentioned earlier wasn't a literal single document, but rather the standardized judicial guidelines and social worker training manuals that flooded the system in the mid-80s. These manuals often cautioned against joint custody, citing that it forced high-conflict parents to interact too frequently. The solution provided by the state was simple: give one parent all the power and the other parent the bill. This created a massive power imbalance. If David's ex-wife wanted to move 3 states away for a new job in 1987, the courts were historically inclined to let her, viewing her personal and financial stability as synonymous with the child's stability. David would then be left with the choice of quitting his job to follow them, or seeing his son only on major holidays. We also have to discuss the rise of the friend of the court and the guardian ad litem. These were third-party observers appointed to represent the child. In the 1980s, these positions were often filled by individuals with very little specialized training in father-child bonding dynamics. They would visit David's new, smaller apartment and look for any reason to deny increased visitation. If he didn't have a dedicated bedroom for the boy, perhaps because David was using half his paycheck for child support and couldn't afford a 2-bedroom, the social worker would report that his home was unsuitable for overnight stays. This was a classic 1980s catch-22. You pay so much in support that you cannot afford the space required to prove you are a fit parent. The data from this period is staggering. By the late 1980s, nearly 90% of mothers were awarded primary physical custody. Even in cases where the father was the one who initiated the divorce due to the wife's misconduct, the tender years residue remained. Judges often spoke about the biological imperative of the mother, a sentiment that was rarely backed by the emerging sociological data, but was firmly rooted in the judicial culture of the time. For a man like David, the courtroom wasn't a place of logic. It was a place where he was forced to audition for a role he had already been playing for years, only to be told he wasn't the lead actor. This era also saw the weaponization of the status quo argument. If David moved out of the house during the initial separation, often on the advice of a lawyer to cool things down, he unknowingly sabotaged his future custody case. In the 1980s, if you were out of the house for 6 months while the legal gears turned, the court would rule that a new status quo had been established. They would argue that the child had adjusted to David being gone, and therefore, changing the schedule to allow him back in for more time would be disruptive. This was a tactical trap that thousands of men fell into. They thought they were being the bigger person by leaving the family home to avoid arguments in front of the kids. but the law interpreted their absence as an abdication of their parental rights. Furthermore, we must examine the 1980s shift in how domestic allegations were handled in custody disputes. This was the decade where the silver bullet strategy began to emerge in legal circles. Because the stakes for custody were so high, and the move toward no fault had removed adultery as a weapon, some legal strategies shifted toward high-conflict allegations to secure a leverage point. In 1988, a simple unverified allegation could result in a temporary restraining order that would bar a father from his home and children for weeks or months before a single piece of evidence was presented. By the time the hearing arrived, the status quo had again been set. David could be cleared of any wrongdoing, but he had already lost the most critical months of the bonding process. The 1980s also introduced the checkbook custody phenomenon. In many states, child support amounts were directly tied to the number of overnights. For the recipient spouse, every night the father spent with the child represented a literal loss of monthly income. This created a financial incentive for mothers to fight against increased visitation. It turned what should have been a discussion about the child's emotional needs into a negotiation over a line item in a budget. David wasn't just fighting for his son. He was inadvertently fighting against his ex-wife's household revenue. This financialization of children is one of the most enduring and controversial historical trends of the 1980s. It shifted the view of the father from a co-parent to a payer. Even the language changed. You weren't a dad, you were an obligor. Your relationship with your child was overseen by the Title 4D agencies, which were incentivized by federal funding to collect as much as possible. The stress of this system led to what sociologists later called the 1980s fatherhood fracture. When you are treated like a visitor and a bank account, the temptation to simply check out becomes a survival mechanism against the pain of constant rejection by the system. But what happened to the men who didn't check out? What happened to the men who decided to take the fight all the way to the state Supreme Courts? In the next part, we are going to look at the rebellion of the 80s dad. We will explore the landmark cases where men finally started to win, the birth of the modern joint custody movement, and the specific legislative turning point in 1989 that started to crack the custody ceiling. We will also look at the rise of parental alienation syndrome as a medicalized term and how it was used and misused to explain the growing distance between fathers and their children. What was the one question a father could ask in 1989 that would finally make a judge stop and listen? The answer would change the American family forever. The year is 1989, and the question that finally began to pierce the veil of the family court system was simple. How does the exclusion of a fit parent serve the child? For nearly a decade, the burden of proof had been on the father to show why he should be involved. By the end of the 80s, the script began to flip. We see this shift manifest in the story of a man named Robert, a construction foreman in Pennsylvania. Robert had spent 3 years fighting for more than the standard 4 days a month. In 1989, his legal team utilized a burgeoning historical trend: the presentation of longitudinal data showing that children with active fathers had better outcomes in school and lower rates of behavioral issues. This was the birth of the data-driven defense. Robert's case was a microcosm of a larger national rebellion. Men were no longer just accepting the role of the weekend visitor. They began to organize into what we now recognize as the early stages of the fathers' rights movement. These groups, often meeting in the basements of community centers or VFW halls, shared strategies that were previously gatekept by expensive attorneys. They discussed the concept of the friendly parent provision. This was a legislative turning point where some states began to mandate that, when determining custody, the court must favor the parent who is more likely to allow the child frequent and continuing contact with the non-custodial parent. For Robert, this meant he could finally point to his ex-wife's constant cancellations of his weekend visits as a reason why she should not have sole legal authority. This legislative shift was a direct response to the phenomenon of parental alienation. In 1985, psychiatrist Richard Gardner coined the term parental alienation syndrome. While highly controversial then and now, its introduction into the 1980s courtroom acted like a lightning bolt. Before this, if a child suddenly refused to see their father, the court often took it at face value, assuming the father must have done something wrong. Gardner's theory suggested a different potential outcome: that one parent was systematically brainwashing the child against the other. For the 1980s dad, this offered a vocabulary for a nightmare they had been living but couldn't name. It allowed Robert to bring in expert witnesses to testify that his son's sudden coldness wasn't a natural developmental stage, but a coached behavior. However, the rebellion of the 80s dad wasn't just fought in the courtroom, it was fought in the state legislatures. By 1989, over 30 states had passed some form of joint custody statute. But here is the catch that many men didn't see coming. Joint legal custody did not mean joint physical custody. This was a crucial distinction that led to massive confusion. Robert might win joint legal custody, meaning he had a say in where his son went to school or what doctor he saw, but the physical schedule remained exactly the same every other weekend. The 1980s legal system was essentially offering men a seat at the table without any food on the plate. They were given the responsibility of decision-making without the time required to build the relationship that makes those decisions meaningful. We must also look at the economic warfare that intensified during this transition. As fathers started winning more legal rights, the financial stakes for mothers increased. If a father moved from a 20% visitation schedule to a 40% schedule, in many states, the child support payment would drop significantly. This created an environment where every extra Tuesday night Robert spent with his son was viewed by the opposition as a direct hit to the household budget. The 1980s ended with the family unit being treated as a zero-sum game. If the father won time, the mother lost money. If the mother won money, the father lost time. This structural flaw fueled the high-conflict litigation that defined the era. Imagine the logistical nightmare for a man like Robert trying to implement these new rights in 1989. There were no cell phones to coordinate schedules. There was no email to document civil communication. If a mother refused to open the door on a Friday at 6 p.m., Robert had to find a payphone, call his lawyer, who wouldn't be available until Monday, and document the incident manually. The police in the 1980s were notoriously hesitant to get involved in civil domestic matters. A father standing on a sidewalk with a court order was often told by responding officers that they couldn't force the mother to hand over the child. This lack of enforcement meant that even when men won on paper, they were often still losing in practice. Step by step, the 1980s man had to become a private investigator of his own life. He had to keep logs of every phone call, every missed visit, and every check cashed. This led to the rise of the pro se father men who, having been bled dry by legal fees in the mid-80s, began representing themselves by the end of the decade. They spent their weekends in law libraries, photocopying statutes and trying to learn the rules of evidence. This was a desperate grassroots effort to reclaim a role that the state had essentially commercialized. The data from 1989 shows a slight uptick in shared residency, but it also shows a massive increase in litigation fatigue. Many men who started the decade with fire in their bellies to remain fathers ended the decade exhausted. The constant friction of the system, the social workers, the hostile exchanges, the garnishments, led to a checkout rate that was tragically high. Society labeled these men as indifferent, but the historical trend suggests they were often just broken by a system that made every interaction a battle. As the 80s drew to a close, the new father image began to emerge in American media. Think of the shift from the distant fathers in early 80s sitcoms to the more involved, albeit often bumbling dads of the late 80s. This cultural shift put more pressure on the courts, but the bureaucratic machinery was slow to change. The decade ended with a massive gap between what society expected of a father and what the law allowed him to be. Robert might be expected to be a sensitive, involved parent by the 1989 cultural standard, but the 1989 legal standard still treated him primarily as a source of revenue. This conflict between cultural expectation and legal reality created a pressure cooker. Men were being told to be more emotional and present, yet the system punished them for seeking the very time required to do so. But there was one final obstacle that many men didn't anticipate as they moved into the 1990s. While they were fighting for time and lower payments, a new technological and forensic tool was being developed that would change the nature of fault and evidence forever. It was something that would make the previous decade's battles look simple. In the next part, we are going to look at the forensic turn. We will examine how the 1980s obsession with stranger danger and the satanic panic bled into family courtrooms, leading to a surge in a specific type of high-stakes allegation that could end a father's access to his children instantly and permanently. We will look at how the 1980s McMartin preschool-era mindset influenced custody evaluations and created a new kind of total war in the divorce process. What happened when the courtroom stopped being about money and started being about the ultimate accusation? The answer involves a psychological phenomenon that almost no man was prepared to defend against. The ultimate accusation emerged from a unique and terrifying cultural intersection in the mid to late 1980s. To understand how this impacted men in divorce court, we have to look at the broader American psyche of 1987. This was the peak of the moral panic. From the McMartin preschool trial to the sensationalized news reports about occult groups, the nation was gripped by a fear that hidden dangers were lurking behind every suburban door. In the family court arena, this translated into an unprecedented surge in allegations of physical and sexual abuse. For a man going through a divorce, these weren't just legal hurdles. They were social and parental death sentences that required no initial proof to trigger an immediate and total loss of rights. Imagine a man named Stephen in 1988. Stephen is a middle school librarian in Denver. He is in the middle of a contentious divorce where he is fighting for 50-50 physical custody. One Friday afternoon, his attorney calls with news that feels like a physical blow. An allegation has been made. Under the 1980s judicial climate, the court's response was governed by a principle of extreme caution. Before a single interview with the child was conducted or a single piece of evidence was presented, an emergency ex parte order was signed. Stephen was barred from his home, prohibited from contacting his children, and essentially branded a predator in the public record. This was the era of the Believe the Child movement. While founded on the noble intent of protecting the vulnerable, the lack of forensic sophistication in the 1980s led to a disastrous historical trend of suggestive interviewing. In Stephen's case, his children might be taken to a state-appointed therapist who used anatomically correct dolls, a practice that was common in 1988, but has since been largely discredited for its high potential to produce false positives through leading questions. If a 5-year-old, under the pressure of a high-stress interview, pointed to a doll in a way the therapist interpreted as suspicious, Stephen's life was effectively over. The forensic landscape of the 1980s was a Wild West. DNA testing was in its infancy and rarely applied to family law cases. Instead, the court relied on psychological evaluations. These evaluations were often conducted by professionals who were deeply influenced by the prevailing panic. The potential outcome for Stephen was a transition from a father fighting for joint custody to a man fighting to avoid prison. Even if the criminal authorities found no grounds for charges, which happened in the vast majority of these cases, the family court operated under a much lower burden of proof, the preponderance of evidence. This meant that if a judge felt there was even a 51% chance that something untoward had happened, Stephen would be permanently relegated to supervised visitation. Supervised visitation in the late 1980s was its own form of psychological torture. Imagine being a father who has been cleared of criminal charges, yet you are only allowed to see your daughter for 1 hour a week in a windowless room at a social services building. A stranger sits in the corner with a clipboard, taking notes on your every interaction. If you hug your child too long, they note it. If you don't hug them enough, they note it. For many men in Stephen's position, the humiliation was too much to bear. This led to the tragic phenomenon of the forced fade away. The legal system created a path so painful and so expensive that men would eventually stop showing up, not because they didn't love their children, but because they couldn't survive the meat grinder of suspicion. We also have to examine the financial fallout of the ultimate accusation. A standard divorce might cost a man $10,000 in 1980s currency. A divorce involving these types of allegations required specialized criminal defense attorneys, private investigators, and counter-expert psychologists. Stephen could easily find himself $50,000 in debt by 1989 just to prove his innocence. Because child support continued to accrue even during the months he was barred from seeing his children, he was effectively paying for a life he was forbidden from participating in. This was the ultimate leverage. In many case studies from this era, these allegations were used as a strategic nuclear option to force a man to drop his claims to the house or his pension in exchange for the privilege of seeing his children again. The 1980s also saw the rise of the specialized domestic violence advocate in the courtroom. While these roles were critical for genuine victims, the 1980s lacked the nuanced protocols to distinguish between high-conflict divorce dynamics and actual domestic terror. Legislation like the 1984 Family Violence Prevention and Services Act provided the framework for increased protection, but in the chaos of a 1980s courtroom, the pendulum often swung so far toward protection that it bypassed due process for the accused father. For Stephen, the mere filing of a protective order could result in his name being added to a state registry, which, given his job as a librarian, meant he could be fired immediately. The 1980s man didn't just lose his family, he lost his career and his reputation in one fell swoop. Step by step, the legal system in the late 80s was perfecting the art of the preemptive strike. A lawyer might advise a female client that if she felt threatened by the husband's request for custody, she should seek a restraining order. This was often done on a Friday afternoon, so the husband wouldn't have a chance to contest it before a judge until Monday or Tuesday. By then, he had been locked out of his life for 72 hours. This was known as the silver bullet because once it was fired, there was no way to take it back. The stigma remained long after the order expired. This climate of fear created a massive rift in the 1980s social fabric. It turned neighbors against each other and made fathers afraid of their own children's innocent comments. If a child told a teacher, "Daddy was wrestling with me," in 1982 it was seen as play. In 1989, it could trigger a mandatory report and a police investigation. Men began to self-censor. They stopped being the rough-and-tumble fathers they had been raised to be because the risk was too high. The 1980s legislated a specific kind of distance into the father-child relationship that had never existed before. As the decade closed, the data revealed a disturbing trend. A significant increase in what was called the divorce-related malicious accusation. While actual abuse was a horrific reality that the 1980s finally began to address, the lack of guardrails in the legal system meant that the innocent were often caught in the same net as the guilty. Stephen, the librarian, might eventually get his name cleared by 1991, but by then, his children would be 3 years older, his savings would be gone, and the bond would be fractured beyond repair. But there was another side to this story. As the legal system became more forensic and more adversarial, it also became more medicalized. The 1980s didn't just give us the panic, it gave us the rise of the specialized divorce therapist. This new class of professionals promised to help families through the transition, but for many men, these therapists became the gatekeepers of their future. In the next part, we are going to look at the therapeutic trap. We will examine how the 1980s shift toward court-ordered counseling became a new form of surveillance for men. We will explore the co-parenting myth of the late 80s, and how it was used to justify keeping fathers in a permanent state of legal and emotional probation. What was the reconciliation trap that many men fell into, thinking they were saving their marriage only to realize they were handing over the evidence for their own destruction? The answer lies in the private notes of the 1980s therapist's office. The therapeutic trap of the late 1980s was often marketed as a compassionate alternative to the cold, hard bench of the courtroom, but for many men, it functioned as an extension of the state's surveillance apparatus. To understand this, imagine a man named Thomas in 1989. Thomas is a Midwestern insurance adjuster who, in a final effort to save his failing marriage, agrees to attend marriage counseling. At this point in the 1980s, there was a cultural surge in the belief that therapy could fix anything. However, the legal landscape had a hidden edge. In many jurisdictions, the moment a divorce was filed, the privilege of confidentiality in those therapy sessions became a gray area. Thomas enters the office of a therapist in a suburban office park, believing he is in a safe space to vent his frustrations, admit his failings, and perhaps find a way back to his wife. Instead, he is unknowingly building the case for his own unfitness as a parent. In 1989, it was a common historical trend for therapists to be subpoenaed to testify or provide their notes to a guardian ad litem. If Thomas admitted to a single instance of losing his temper, even if it resulted in nothing more than a raised voice, that admission was documented. In the hands of an aggressive opposing counsel, that note was transformed from a therapeutic breakthrough into evidence of an anger management problem that necessitated restricted visitation. This leads us to the reconciliation trap. Many men in the 80s were socialized to believe that if they just worked harder, they could fix the problem. They were encouraged by their spouses, and sometimes their own lawyers, to enter into trial periods or counseling sessions. But for Thomas, every session where he bared his soul was a tactical disadvantage. If he expressed sadness or depression regarding the state of his marriage, those emotions were weaponized to label him as emotionally unstable. The 1980s therapist was often more concerned with the immediate safety and comfort of the mother and child, a bias rooted in the psychological theories of the decade, leaving the father to navigate a minefield where his vulnerability was his greatest liability. The 1980s also introduced court-ordered co-parenting classes. These were often mandated for fathers who were deemed difficult, simply because they were fighting for more than 15% of the parenting time. Imagine Thomas sitting in a community center basement in 1989, being lectured on how to communicate with his ex-wife by a facilitator who has never met his children. These classes were often based on a one-size-fits-all model that prioritized the avoidance of conflict over the rights of the father. If Thomas spoke up about the fact that his ex-wife was withholding his weekend visits, he was labeled as uncooperative or unable to separate his needs from the child's needs. This label was then fed back to the judge, creating a feedback loop that made it nearly impossible for him to secure joint custody. Step by step, the 1980s man was forced into a state of performance fatherhood. He had to act perfectly at all times because he was being watched by a network of professionals. The therapist, the school counselor, and the social worker were all collecting data. If Thomas missed a single session of his court-ordered therapy because of a work conflict at the insurance firm, it was reported as a lack of commitment to his family. This created an impossible standard. He was expected to be the primary financial provider, working long hours to cover child support and legal fees, while simultaneously being as available as a stay-at-home parent for various therapeutic and legal appointments. Another layer of the therapeutic trap was the 1980s obsession with the transition period. Experts of the era argued that children needed a long period of adjustment after a divorce where they spent the vast majority of their time in the primary home. This theory was used to justify a 2-year or 3-year temporary schedule that heavily favored the mother. For Thomas, this meant that even if he was a model parent, the therapist might recommend that his 5-year-old daughter only see him on Sundays for the first year to maintain stability. By the time the year was over, the child had effectively become a stranger to him, and the court would then argue that increasing his time would be too traumatic for the child. This was a form of professionalized alienation that was nearly impossible to fight because it was backed by people with "doctor" in front of their names. Case studies from the late 1980s show that men who successfully navigated this trap were often the ones who stopped talking. They learned to treat therapy like a corporate deposition. They provided short, neutral answers and shared no personal information. But this too was a trap. If a man was too closed off, the therapist would report that he was emotionally distant or incapable of empathy. The 1980s legal therapeutic complex was a machine that demanded a specific type of performance, a performance of a man who was remorseful but not depressed, assertive but not angry, and involved but not controlling. We must also consider the rise of the private custody evaluation. This was the 1980s version of a deep dive investigation. A psychologist would spend 20 to 30 hours observing the family. For Thomas, this meant having a stranger come to his new apartment and watch him make dinner for his children. Imagine the pressure of 1989 parenting under a microscope. If the kids were too quiet, it was evidence of a stifling environment. If they were too loud, it was evidence of a lack of discipline. The evaluator's report, which could cost $5,000 to $10,000, often carried more weight than any other piece of evidence in the trial. Many men found that these evaluators had personal biases regarding what a father's role should be. Biases that often leaned toward the provider role, rather than the nurturer role. By 1989, the therapeutic industry had become a major stakeholder in the divorce process. It was a lucrative business. For every contested divorce, there were multiple therapists, evaluators, and consultants involved. This created an incentive for the system to remain high conflict. The longer the adjustment period lasted, the more sessions were billed. Thomas wasn't just a father. He was a client in a multi-billion-dollar industry. The data from the end of the decade suggests that the more professional help a family received, the longer the litigation actually lasted, and the more likely the father was to eventually lose contact with his children. The 1980s ended with a generation of men who felt gaslit by the system. They were told they were being helped, but every hand reached out to help them seemed to be holding a pen to write a negative report. They were invited into the therapist's office under the guise of healing, only to find that the notes from those sessions were being used as a roadmap for their own exclusion. This era taught men a hard lesson. In the world of 1980s divorce, everything you say can and will be used against you, even if you say it to a doctor. But as the 1990s approached, the battleground shifted again. The therapeutic trap had left men weary and wary, but a new movement was brewing in the dark corners of the legal world. It was a movement that moved beyond psychology and into the realm of raw, cold economics. If the therapists couldn't be trusted, the men began to look at the one thing that still spoke louder than any expert witness: the dollar. In the next part, we are going to look at the hidden math of the 90s transition. We will examine how the 1980s ended by setting the stage for the most aggressive child support collection tactics in history. We will look at the creation of the deadbeat dad myth as a political tool, and how it was used to justify the seizure of professional licenses and the use of the 1980s war on drugs tactics against divorced fathers. What happened when the state decided that a father's value wasn't found in a therapist's office, but in his tax return? The answer involves a massive legislative shift that would change the American workforce forever. As the 1980s transitioned into the early 90s, a new archetype was manufactured in the American political laboratory: the deadbeat dad. This was not just a social label. It was a legislative catalyst used to justify some of the most aggressive financial enforcement actions in United States history. To understand this, we must look at the case of a man named Christopher, a freelance graphic designer in Chicago in 1989. Christopher is a prime example of how the 1980s ended by turning the father into a purely economic entity. Christopher was not a man who abandoned his children. He was a man who, following a massive economic downturn in the advertising industry, saw his monthly income drop by 40%. In the 1980s legal framework, child support was often treated as a fixed cost, much like a commercial lease. The system was historically slow to recognize the volatility of the new service-based economy. When Christopher applied for a downward modification of his support payments because he could no longer afford the $1,200 monthly obligation set during his peak earning years, he hit a brick wall. The 1980s courts operated under the theory of imputed income. This meant the judge didn't care what Christopher was actually making in 1989. They only cared what he was capable of making. If he had earned $50,000 in 1986, the court imputed that same earning capacity to him indefinitely. Christopher was legally required to pay support based on money he no longer had. This led to the debt trap of 1989. Because Christopher couldn't pay the full amount, he began to accrue arrears. In the late 80s, these arrears were often subject to high interest rates, sometimes as much as 12% per year depending on the state. Unlike almost every other form of debt in America, child support arrears could not be discharged in bankruptcy. Christopher was carrying a financial anchor that grew heavier every single month. He struggled to find work. By 1990, he owed $15,000 in back support, plus interest and legal fees. Then came the hammer of the 1988 Family Support Act. This federal mandate required states to implement increasingly punitive measures to collect these debts. For Christopher, the first sign of this shift was the seizure of his tax refund. In previous decades, a tax refund might have been the small buffer a divorced man used to fix his car or pay for a security deposit on a new apartment. By 1989, that money was intercepted by the state before it ever reached his mailbox. But the enforcement didn't stop at tax returns. The late 80s saw the birth of license revocation programs. Imagine Christopher's situation. To pay off his $15,000 debt, he needs to drive to client meetings and use his professional certifications. However, under the new 1980s enforcement trends, the state decided that the best way to make him pay was to take away his driver's license and his professional design credentials. This created a paradoxical cycle of failure. The state was effectively saying, "You must pay us more money, but we are going to make it legally impossible for you to work." For many men in the late 80s, this was the moment of total collapse. They were forced into the underground economy, taking under-the-table jobs just to survive, which only furthered the narrative that they were hiding assets. We must also analyze the use of the 1980s war on drugs tactics in the realm of domestic collections. This was the decade of the most wanted posters for non-custodial parents. In 1989, it became a common historical trend for state agencies to publish the names and photos of men with high arrears in local newspapers and on television. This public shaming ignored the nuance of the economic recession, or the imputed income traps. For a man like Christopher, this meant that even if he found a potential employer, a simple background check or a glance at the local paper would label him a criminal. The 1980s system was no longer interested in the well-being of the family. It was interested in the recovery of state-funded welfare costs. Step by step, the government began to view child support as a way to reimburse the state for aid to families with dependent children, or AFDC. If a mother was receiving state assistance, the state would sue the father to recoup those costs. This turned the father into a debtor to the state, not just to his family. The 1984 Child Support Enforcement Amendments had already paved the way. But by 1989, the infrastructure for mass wage garnishment was fully operational. For the first time, the relationship between a man and his employer was mediated by a state enforcement officer. This economic pressure had a devastating effect on the American workforce. Data from the era indicates a rise in job hopping among divorced men who were trying to stay one step ahead of the garnishment orders. It wasn't always because they didn't want to pay. It was often because the garnishment took so much from their check, sometimes up to 65% of their disposable income, that they couldn't afford the gas to get to work or the rent to stay near their job. The 1980s legal system had created a permanent underclass of divorced men. Furthermore, we must address the 1980s shift in the burden of proof for financial hardship. In most civil cases, the plaintiff has to prove the defendant can pay. In 1980s family court, the man had to prove he couldn't pay. Christopher had to hire accountants and vocational experts to prove that the advertising market in Chicago had actually collapsed. Each of these experts cost thousands of dollars. The cost of proving you were broke was, ironically, something only a wealthy man could afford. For the average middle-class father, the only potential outcome was a default judgment and a mounting pile of debt. The case studies from this transition period show a clear divergence. Men with significant liquid assets could negotiate lump sum settlements that protected their future earnings. But the average man, the one whose only asset was his weekly paycheck, was subject to a lifetime of state-monitored labor. The 1980s ended the era of the private divorce. By 1990, if you were a divorced man in America, the government knew exactly what you made, where you lived, and what you owed. You were no longer a citizen in a family, you were a line item in a state budget. This total financial surveillance was the precursor to the modern digital tracking systems we see today. It began with the 1980s mainframe computers and the first centralized databases of Social Security numbers. This was the moment the system became a machine that never slept and never forgot a missed payment, regardless of the circumstances. Christopher eventually lost his business, his car, and his apartment. By the time the 1990s began, he was living in a rooming house, his children were told he didn't care enough to support them, and the state had a permanent lien on any future inheritance or lottery win he might ever receive. The 1980s didn't just change the laws, it changed the very nature of what it meant to be a father. It moved from a social role to a purely financial obligation, backed by the full police power of the state. But as the decade closed, a new and even more complex variable was introduced into this equation. While the state was tracking the money, a new kind of expert was beginning to track the mind of the man. In the next part, we are going to look at the psychological profile of the 80s defendant. We will examine how the 1980s rise of the profile led to the targeting of specific personality types in divorce court. We will look at how a man's hobbies, his choice of friends, and even his 1980s record collection could be used to build a profile of instability. What happened when the court decided that being a man's man was a psychological red flag? The answer involves a radical shift in how the American male identity was judged by the state. The radical shift in the American male identity during 1980s divorce proceedings was anchored in a new clinical scrutiny of traditional masculinity. To understand this, let us look at the case study of James, a veteran and a construction foreman in Seattle in 1988. James represents a generation of men who were raised with the silent, stoic values of the post-war era. He believed that being a good father meant providing a stable roof, discipline, and a strong work ethic. However, when James entered the family court system, those very traits were reframed through a burgeoning psychological lens that viewed traditional masculinity as a potential risk factor. In the late 1980s, the rise of the psychological profile meant that every aspect of a man's personality was up for clinical interpretation. If James spent his weekends hunting or at the shooting range, it was no longer viewed as a standard American hobby. In a contested custody battle, it was reframed as an obsession with violence or a sign of an aggressive temperament. If he had a collection of classic rock records or a preference for war movies, these were used to build a profile of a man stuck in a state of arrested development or hyperaggression. This was the era where the man's man became a psychological red flag. The state began to favor a more sensitive, communicative, and arguably more compliant male archetype, and those who did not fit this mold were often penalized in custody evaluations. Imagine the courtroom scene in 1989. James is asked about his parenting style. He mentions that he believes in firm boundaries, and that he doesn't believe in coddling. In 1955, this would have been seen as virtuous. In 1989, a court-appointed psychologist could interpret this as emotional availability or a lack of empathy. The historical trend was moving toward a nurturing-only model of parenting, and the disciplinary role traditionally held by fathers was being pathologized. James found himself in a position where he had to apologize for the very traits that made him a successful provider and protector. He was being judged by a set of standards that had changed in the middle of his life, without a manual on how to adapt. This clinical profiling extended into the realm of social associations. In 1980s divorce cases, who a man spent his time with became a matter of public record. If James belonged to a fraternal organization or a veterans group, opposing counsel might argue that these environments fostered a patriarchal or exclusionary mindset that was detrimental to the child's upbringing in a modernizing world. Even his choice of friends was scrutinized. If his friends were also divorced men, they were labeled as a bad influence, a bitter support group that would allegedly alienate the child from the mother. The 1980s man was effectively isolated from his social support network at the exact moment he needed it most, under the threat that these associations would reflect poorly on his character in court. Step by step, the legal system utilized standardized tests like the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or MMPI, which became a staple of 1980s custody battles. For a man like James, these tests were a minefield. The MMPI was designed to detect psychopathology, but in the high-stress environment of a divorce, a man's natural defensiveness or anger at the system could be interpreted as paranoia or a personality disorder. If James answered honestly that he felt people were out to get him, which, given his experience in the family court system, felt like a literal fact, the test would score him high on the paranoia scale. This data was then presented to the judge as objective scientific proof that James was mentally unstable. The potential outcomes for men who failed to navigate this psychological tightrope were severe. A high score on a poorly interpreted personality test could result in a court order for a year of intensive psychotherapy before joint custody could even be considered. This wasn't just about mental health. It was about behavioral modification. The state was using the divorce process to enforce a new social standard for male behavior. Case studies from this era show that men who were more traditionally masculine were statistically more likely to be ordered into these types of corrective programs compared to men who adopted a more soft-spoken, agreeable persona during the litigation. Furthermore, we have to look at how the 1980s media influenced these judicial profiles. This was the decade of the sensitive New Age guy, a cultural trope that was often held up as the ideal in magazines and on television. Judges and social workers were not immune to this cultural zeitgeist. When a man like James walked into a room wearing a flannel shirt and work boots, speaking in short sentences, he was already fighting an uphill battle against a stereotype. The 1980s was the first decade where a man's aesthetic and communication style were treated as primary evidence of his suitability as a parent. The court was looking for a co-pilot, but James was a captain, and the system had decided the ship no longer needed one. This psychological profiling also touched on a man's professional life. In the late 80s, if a man had a high-stress job, such as a construction foreman, a police officer, or a trader, the court would often use his career choice against him. They would argue that the intensity of his work life would inevitably bleed into his home life, making him too volatile for primary custody. This created a situation where the more a man succeeded in the traditional role of provider, the more he was disqualified from the role of parent. James was essentially told that his dedication to his career, which provided the very child support the state demanded, was the same thing that made him a danger to his children's emotional stability. By 1989, the state's profile of the American male was a caricature of suspicion. Every hobby, from working on cars to playing poker, was categorized and filed. If a man had a home workshop with power tools, it was scrutinized for child safety to an absurd degree, far beyond what would be asked of a mother's sewing room or kitchen. This was a form of microsurveillance that aimed to find any crack in the armor of the traditional male identity. James eventually felt he had to hide his true self. He stopped going to his veterans' meetings, he sold his motorcycle, and he tried to speak in the gentle tones the social workers seemed to prefer. He was participating in the erasure of his own identity just to maintain a relationship with his kids. The 1980s ended with a profound sense of alienation among American men. They had been told that the old rules of being a man were dead, but the new rules were a moving target that seemed designed to ensure their failure. The psychological profile wasn't just a tool for the court, it was a weapon of social engineering. It sent a clear message: the traditional American father was an obsolete model, and the state was the new architect of the family. But as the 1990s loomed, the focus shifted from the mind of the man to the physical location of the man. The state began to realize that profiling a man was one thing, but controlling his movement was another. The decade of the 80s had tried to change who men were. The 90s would try to dictate exactly where they could go. The transition into the next era of divorce would be defined by a new technological boundary that turned the entire country into a digital cage for the divorced father. In the next part, we are going to look at the geographic lock. We will examine how the 1980s ended by passing the first major anti-relocation laws that effectively turned divorced men into internal exiles. We will look at how the move-away cases of 1989 created a legal barrier that prevented men from seeking better jobs or moving to be closer to their extended families. What happened when the court decided that a father's presence was mandatory for paying bills but optional for parenting, yet forbade him from leaving the county? The answer involves a new form of legal residency that looked more like house arrest. The geographic lock of the late 1980s was the final iron bar in the cage of the divorced American male. To understand the gravity of this shift, we must look at the case study of a man named Mark, an aerospace engineer in Southern California in 1989. Mark had navigated the financial decimation of his assets, endured the psychological profiling that labeled his stoic nature as a red flag, and had finally secured a modest visitation schedule of 4 days a month. However, the aerospace industry in California began to contract as the Cold War wound down. Mark was offered a high-paying position in Texas, a job that would allow him to finally get ahead of his mounting child support arrears, and perhaps afford a home where his children could actually have their own rooms. But in 1989, a new historical trend was taking hold in the appellate courts: the move-away restriction. When Mark informed the court of his intent to relocate for work, he was met with the legal injunction. The court's logic was a masterclass in contradiction. On one hand, the state demanded that Mark maintain his high level of financial support, which required him to be gainfully employed. On the other hand, the court ruled that his relocation would disrupt the stability of the visitation schedule, even though that schedule only allowed him to see his children 15% of the time. Mark was faced with a devastating choice: stay in California, lose his job and face jail time for non-payment of support, or move to Texas for the job and legally forfeit his parental rights due to abandonment. This was the geographic lock in action. It effectively turned divorced men into internal exiles within their own counties. While the 1980s saw a massive increase in the mobility of the American workforce, the family court system began to operate like a feudal estate. If you were a divorced father, your right to travel and your right to pursue better economic opportunities were now secondary to the administrative convenience of the state's collection agencies. For Mark, the court suggested he simply find a lower-paying job at a local grocery store rather than move, ignoring the fact that his child support order was based on his engineer's salary. This was the imputed income trap meeting the geographic lock, creating a zero-sum game that almost no man could win. The 1980s also saw the rise of the specialized relocation expert. These were often social workers or child psychologists who would testify that a father moving away, even if he was moving to a state with a lower cost of living to better provide for the child, would cause irreparable psychological harm. Yet, in a glaring example of the era's double standards, if the mother wanted to move for a new marriage or a better lifestyle, the historical trend was for the court to grant her permission under the good faith doctrine. The logic was that the mother's happiness was the primary driver of the child's well-being. For Mark, this meant he was anchored to a specific zip code by law, while his ex-wife remained free to move the children across the country, effectively nullifying his visitation anyway. Imagine the logistical nightmare of the 1980s long-distance father. In 1989, there were no video calls. Long-distance phone rates were expensive, often costing 20 to 30 cents a minute. If Mark did manage to move for work, his relationship with his children was reduced to a few expensive minutes a week and the occasional high-stress flight during summer breaks. The legal system in the 80s had no framework for virtual visitation. Once a father crossed a state line, he became a visitor in the eyes of the law, and his ability to enforce his rights diminished with every mile. Step by step, the 1980s man was being deterritorialized. He no longer had a home of his own. He lived in a series of temporary apartments. He no longer had the right to seek better work. He was tied to the court that issued his support order. This created a phenomenon known as economic stagnation of the divorced male. Men who would have otherwise been the engines of the 1980s economic boom were playing it safe, refusing promotions or new opportunities because any change in their geographic or financial status would trigger a new, expensive round of litigation. The fear of being hauled back into court kept them in low-growth positions, which in the long run, reduced the total pool of resources available for their children. The data from the end of the 1980s reveals a sharp increase in interstate child support enforcement cases. The federal government, through the Bradley Amendment of 1986, had made it impossible for judges to retroactively lower child support debt. This meant that if Mark moved to Texas, lost his job for 2 months and couldn't pay, that debt was permanent. It didn't matter if he later got a job making double. The arrears were a fixed, unchangeable mark on his record. By 1990, the state had the power to seize his driver's license across state lines through new national databases. The geographic lock wasn't just about where you lived. It was about the state's ability to track you across the entire United States. We must also analyze the impact on the extended family dynamic. When Mark was locked into his county, his parents, the children's grandparents, were also effectively cut off if they lived elsewhere. The 1980s legal system viewed the father as a solo actor, ignoring the vast network of support that a paternal family provides. By restricting Mark's movement, the state was also restricting the children's access to their paternal heritage. This led to what sociologists later called paternal lineage erasure. In the 1980s, if the father couldn't move to where the support system was, and the support system couldn't come to him, the bond withered away. This era of house arrest by decree led to a surge in underground fatherhood. Some men, feeling they had nothing left to lose, simply vanished. They took on new identities or moved to states where the 1980s computer systems hadn't yet linked up. These weren't the deadbeat dads of the media's imagination. These were often broken men like Mark who felt that the only way to survive was to become a ghost. This was a tragedy of the system's own making. By making the rules of participation so punitive and the boundaries so tight, the 1980s legal system forced good men into desperate positions. As we look at the final year of the decade, 1989 stands as the peak of this restrictive architecture. The 1980s man had been stripped of his property, his reputation, his psychological autonomy, and finally, his freedom of movement. He was a man who belonged to the state, a permanent obligor, whose primary purpose was the regular transfer of funds. But there was one final thing the system couldn't account for: the long-term memory of the children themselves. In the final part of this masterclass, we are going to look at the legacy of the 80s divorce. We will examine what happened 20 years later, when the children of these 1980s court battles became adults. We will look at the reconciliation wave of the 2000s and 2010s and the data on how the 1980s legal experiment actually impacted the next generation's view of marriage and fatherhood. What was the ultimate cost of the clean break philosophy? The answer is written in the lives of the millions of Americans who grew up in the shadow of the 1980s family court. And it reveals a truth that the judges of 1989 never saw coming. The truth that the judges of 1989 never saw coming was that while you can legislate a man out of a house, you cannot legislate him out of a child's DNA or their long-term memory. As we stand here in 2026, looking back at the wreckage of the 1980s family court experiment, we see a phenomenon known as the Great Reconciliation. This is the stage where the children of the 80s, now in their 40s and 50s, have begun to look back at their childhoods with a forensic eye. They are discovering that the distant, shadowy figure of their father wasn't a man who simply chose to leave, but a man who was often pushed out by a system that viewed his presence as optional and his paycheck as mandatory. Imagine a woman named Jennifer in 2026. Her parents divorced in 1984 when she was 6. For 20 years, her narrative was that her father, Greg, was a deadbeat because he missed visits and eventually stopped calling. But as Jennifer navigates her own adulthood, she finds an old box of court documents in her mother's attic. She sees the 1980s child support orders that took 60% of Greg's take-home pay. She sees the legal motions where he begged for more time and was denied by a judge who cited the primary caretaker rule. She realizes that Greg wasn't absent by choice. He was a man who had been economically and psychologically broken by the geographic lock and the therapeutic trap. This realization is a historical trend occurring across the United States today, leading to a massive shift in how the 1980s are remembered. The legacy of the 80s divorce is first and foremost a legacy of father hunger. Data from the early 2000s began to show the long-term potential outcomes for children who grew up in the shadow of the 1988 Family Support Act. These children were statistically more likely to experience early school dropout, substance abuse issues, and their own relationship instability. The 1980s goal of a clean break, the idea that a child only needed one stable primary home to thrive, was proven to be a catastrophic oversimplification. The system had prioritized the short-term administrative ease of the state over the long-term emotional development of the next generation. Step by step, we can see how the 1980s created the blueprint for the current fatherhood crisis. By turning the father into an obligor rather than a co-parent, the state signaled to an entire generation of boys that their value in a family was purely transactional. This has led to a measurable decline in marriage rates among men who witnessed their fathers' 1980s legal battles. These men, now entering their prime in the 2020s, often view the family court system as a high-risk environment with no safety net. They saw the house lost, the pension divided, and the visitation restricted, and they concluded that the only way to win the game was not to play. Furthermore, we must address the impact of the silver bullet on the children of the 80s, when false or exaggerated allegations were used in 1987 to secure custody. The children were the secondary victims. They were often forced into supervised visitation with fathers they loved, or worse, cut off entirely based on the coached testimony of a 5-year-old. As these children grew up, many experienced a secondary trauma: the realization that they were used as pawns in a scorched earth legal strategy. The 1980s divorce wasn't just a war between parents. It was a war on the child's sense of reality. In 2026, we see a surge in these adult children seeking out their estranged fathers to apologize, a reversal that the 1980s sociologists never predicted. The financial legacy is equally staggering. The 1980s transition to aggressive collection and imputed income didn't just hurt the fathers. It drained the total wealth of the American middle class. Billions of dollars that could have been used for college tuitions or down payments for the next generation were instead funneled into legal fees, private investigators, and state-mandated social workers. The 1980s divorce industry was a wealth transfer machine that took money from families and gave it to the state and the legal profession. Many of the financial struggles faced by Gen X and millennials today can be traced back to the liquidation of their fathers' assets in a 1985 courtroom. We also have to look at the legislative correction that started far too late for the men of the 80s. It wasn't until the 2010s and 2020s that many states began to pass true 50-50 shared parenting laws, assuming equal time as the starting point. This movement is a direct result of the data gathered from the failures of the 1980s. The 1980s served as the before picture in a national case study on what happens when you remove a father from the home. The current push for fatherhood initiatives is a desperate attempt to repair the damage done by the policies of 1984 and 1988. Imagine the perspective of Greg, Jennifer's father, in 2026. He is now 70 years old. He spent the best years of his life working a job he hated just to pay off interest on arrears for children he barely knew. He lives on a reduced pension because of the Retirement Equity Act of 1984. His story is not unique. It is the story of millions of American men who were the silent casualties of a social experiment. The 1980s didn't just change the way we end marriages. It changed the way we value men's contributions to the domestic sphere. It moved the needle from father as guide to father as ATM, and we are still trying to move it back. The 1980s deep dive reveals that the divorce revolution was less about liberation and more about the bureaucratization of the family. The state stepped into the void left by the disappearing nuclear family and tried to manage it with spreadsheets, psychological profiles, and wage garnishments. The lesson for the audience in 2026 is clear. The system is designed for finality and collection, not for healing or relationship building. The clean break was a myth. There is no such thing as a clean break when children are involved. There is only the long, slow process of managing the fallout. As we conclude this 10-part masterclass, we have to ask ourselves, have we truly learned the lessons of the 80s? While the laws have improved, the underlying machinery of the family court still carries the DNA of that era. The suspicion of the father, the prioritization of the primary household, and the financialization of child-rearing are all 1980s ghosts that still haunt our courtrooms today. By understanding the history of how we got here, from the no-fault explosion to the geographic lock, we can begin to build a system that actually serves the best interests of the child rather than the administrative interests of the state. The story of the 1980s man in divorce court is the story of a generation that was caught between two worlds. They were the last generation expected to be the sole providers and the first generation to be legally discarded when that role was no longer convenient. But the story doesn't end in the courtroom of 1989. It ends in the living rooms of 2026, where fathers and children are finally sitting down to talk, without lawyers, without therapists, and without the state, to reconstruct the truth of what was lost. This deep dive has uncovered the hidden costs and the systemic traps that defined a decade of domestic warfare. But while the 1980s focused on the end of the family, the next era is about the reconstruction of the father's role in a post-litigation world. The question now is not how we divide the assets but how we preserve the bond. If you want to see how the modern movement for parental equality is finally dismantling the last of the 1980s barriers, and what new challenges are emerging in the era of digital surveillance, you won't want to miss our next series. We are moving from the history of the fracture to the future of the family, and the first step involves a radical new approach to the very concept of the best interest standard.